The night my daughter-in-law announced her pregnancy at Thanksgiving, she slid the ultrasound photo across the table toward my husband and said, "This baby already has a real grandmother." She didn't look at me when she said it. Everyone heard it. The clink of silverware stopped. Even the football game murmuring in the background seemed to pause. I was holding a serving spoon mid-air, green beans dripping back into the dish, my wrist suddenly numb. I smiled anyway. I have learned that skill over decades. The kind of smile that keeps the peace while something inside you quietly cracks. My name is Margaret Hale. I was 59 years old that night, and I had been married to Richard Hale for 34 years. I helped raise his son from his first marriage. I packed his lunches, stayed up through fevers, sat through school concerts, paid for braces, college applications, and the first car he totaled 2 weeks after buying it. But that night at my own dining table, I learned that none of it counted. Emily, my daughter-in-law, had been waiting for that moment. I saw it in her eyes, sharp and rehearsed, like she had practiced the line in the mirror. Her mother, Linda, sat beside her in a cream sweater that probably cost more than my monthly grocery bill, nodding gently as if she had just witnessed something sweet rather than cruel. Richard cleared his throat. "Well," he said weakly, "that's nice." "Nice!" I excused myself to the kitchen, blaming the gravy. My hands shook so badly I had to grip the counter. Through the doorway I heard Emily laughing, already talking about baby showers and nursery colors. Linda chimed in, listing her friends who would help the pediatrician. She preferred the private preschool that everyone important used. No one said my name. Later that night, as I washed dishes alone, Richard came up behind me and wrapped his arms around my waist. "Don't take it personally," he murmured. "You know how Emily is." I turned off the faucet and faced him. "She just told a room full of people that I don't exist." He sighed, already tired of the conversation. "She meant biological. You're sensitive." Sensitive. That word followed me to bed, where I lay awake listening to my husband fall asleep within minutes unbothered while I stared at the ceiling and replayed the moment over and over. The way Emily had emphasized real. The way Linda's lips had curved just slightly in satisfaction. What none of them knew, what I had never corrected, was that I wasn't powerless in that room. I wasn't just the quiet second wife with sensible shoes and a dependable casserole. I had something they didn't expect, something I had protected quietly for years. And that night, staring into the dark, I realized something else. They weren't just excluding me, they were underestimating me. By Christmas, the pattern was unmistakable. The baby registry arrived in the mail. Linda's name was listed as primary contact. The Christmas card featured Emily, my stepson Daniel, and Linda standing together in front of a mansion I recognized immediately. Linda's house. I wasn't in the photo, not even mentioned. When I asked Daniel about it, he shrugged. "Mom said it was easier that way." Mom. He meant Linda. That was the moment something inside me shifted. Not loudly, not dramatically. Just a quiet click, like a lock finally engaging. I stopped trying. I stopped offering opinions. Stopped volunteering to help. Stopped reminding Daniel of the years I had been there, when Linda had been too busy building her real estate empire to attend a single-parent teacher conference. I watched instead, and I noticed everything. I noticed how often Linda talked about legacy, about family money, about who would inherit what. I noticed how Emily's eyes lit up when the word trust fund was mentioned. And I noticed how Richard, my husband, grew quieter every time finances came up. What I didn't notice at first was how carefully they were planning around me. But I would, soon. The first time I realized my husband was lying to me about money was the morning a lawyer's letter arrived, addressed to him and not to both of us. I found it tucked beneath the mail slot, cream envelope, thick paper. I recognized the firm immediately. Whitman and Cole, estate planning, trust administration. I had worked in corporate accounting for over 20 years. I knew those letterheads the way some women know perfume brands. I didn't open it. I placed it neatly on the hall table and waited. Richard came home that evening in a foul mood, jacket still on, as he poured himself a drink. He froze when he saw the envelope. "Oh," he said too quickly. "That." "What is that?" I asked. "Nothing important." We had been married long enough that the lie hung between us, heavy and unmistakable. I waited. Silence has always been my sharpest tool. "It's just a review," he finally said. "Routine." "Of what?" He drank, avoided my eyes. "Linda suggested we update some things." "We?" That word did not include me. I smiled again, that same careful smile, Update what things Richard, our wills. There it was. I felt the air leave my lungs slowly controlled. Why would Linda be involved in our wills? He rubbed his temple. It's complicated. It always is when someone thinks you won't push. But I didn't push. Not then. Instead, I did something far more dangerous. I listened. Over the next weeks, I pieced together the truth the way I used to reconcile accounts. Line by line. Discrepancy by discrepancy. Richard had assets I didn't know about. Accounts opened before our marriage never disclosed. A family trust from his parents recently restructured. Linda was named executor. Executor. I was not. I also learned that Daniel had been promised something substantial: property, investments, a future that did not include me anywhere in the picture. I was not angry yet. I was curious. On a cold January afternoon, I made an appointment of my own, a different law firm, smaller, quieter, a woman named Susan Klein who specialized in marital asset review. She listened without interrupting as I laid out everything: Thanksgiving, the baby, the letter, the omissions. When I finished, she folded her hands. How long have you been married? 34 years. And you've never seen the trust documents? No. Her expression hardened. Then you need to. What happens, I asked carefully, if I don't exist in them? Then someone worked very hard to make sure you didn't. I drove home with my heart pounding, not from fear but from clarity. That night I opened a safe I hadn't touched in years. Inside were documents from my own past. Inheritance from my mother. A modest portfolio that had grown quietly over decades. A house fully paid off in my name alone. I had never hidden it out of malice. I had hidden it out of habit, out of a lifetime of being the sensible one. The backup plan, the woman who made sure there was always something left if everything else fell apart. Turns out everything else already had. At Sunday dinner the following week, Emily announced they were moving closer to Linda. For the baby, she said, smiling, family should be together. Linda reached over and squeezed her hand. Especially real family. Daniel looked at me then, just briefly. Something like guilt flickered across his face. I raised my glass. That sounds lovely. No one noticed my hands were steady now, because I had finally stopped waiting to be chosen, and I had started planning. At the end of the evening, Linda leaned toward me. You've been so quiet lately, Margaret. Everything all right? I met her eyes and smiled slow and polite. Never better, I said. And I meant it. The baby shower invitation arrived on a Tuesday, pale blue cardstock with gold lettering and a return address that wasn't mine. Linda's name sat proudly in the corner. Host. I read the details twice. Country club venue. Catered brunch. Private room overlooking the golf course. A guest list that included Linda's friends, Emily's coworkers, and people whose names I vaguely recognized from Richard's past. Mine was not mentioned anywhere except as an afterthought handwritten at the bottom. And Margaret, of course. No +1, no role, no acknowledgement beyond politeness. That was when I knew this wasn't accidental. This was systematic. I placed the invitation beside the lawyer's card Susan Klein had given me and felt something inside me harden into resolve. For decades I had believed endurance was love. That if I stayed quiet, stayed useful, stayed generous, things would balance out eventually. They never do. At the shower, I arrived early, dressed carefully, hair neat, posture straight. The room buzzed with laughter and champagne flutes. Linda greeted me with a kiss on the cheek that didn't reach her eyes. Margaret, she said, lowering her voice, we didn't think you'd want to sit through all this fuss. I wouldn't miss it, I replied. She smiled tightly. During the gift opening, I noticed something else. Every card Emily read aloud emphasized family, our baby, our legacy, our traditions. Linda beamed every time. When it was my gift, Emily hesitated. She glanced at Linda before reading the card. Her smile faded just a little. From Margaret, she said. No speech, no thank you speech, just a nod. I had given them something meaningful. Bonds, savings, not flashy but solid, practical. Linda leaned toward Emily and whispered something. Emily laughed. That laugh stayed with me. Later in the restroom, I overheard two women talking. Linda's friends. She's not even blood, one said. But Richard stays married to her because it's easier, the other replied. I walked out without correcting them. I didn't need to anymore. That night, Richard barely spoke to me. He was distracted, scrolling through his phone, nodding at messages I couldn't see. I asked him one simple question. Am I in your will? He froze. What kind of question is that? A direct one. He looked away. We'll talk about it later. Later had become his favorite word. Later was where inconvenient truths went to die. I stood up. No, we talk now. He rubbed his face, irritated. Linda just thinks things should be organized. That's all. And do you? Silence. That silence told me everything. I slept in the guest room that night, not out of spite, but clarity. For the first time, I saw my marriage not as a partnership, but a convenience that had outlived its usefulness to everyone but me. The next morning, I met Susan again. She reviewed the documents I had quietly gathered: bank statements, old tax returns, trust summaries I had requested under the guise of routine paperwork. Susan leaned back in her chair. They're planning a future that excludes you financially and emotionally. I know, and you're entitled to more than you're being given. I don't want more, I said. I want control. Her eyes sharpened. Then we proceed carefully. Carefully was my specialty. The turning point came on Valentine's Day. Not because of romance, because of a conversation I wasn't supposed to hear. I had come home early from errands, my arms full of groceries, when I heard voices in the living room. Richard, Linda, Daniel. I stopped in the hallway, heart-pounding instinct telling me to stay still. She won't fight it, Linda was saying. Margaret avoids conflict. Always has. Daniel sounded uneasy. Still feels wrong. Wrong doesn't pay for a nursery, Linda snapped. Or a house upgrade. Richard cleared his throat. We're not taking everything from her. But you're not giving her anything either, Linda replied. Which is the point? My hands trembled, not from shock, from confirmation. They were planning my erasure as calmly as a grocery list. I stepped into the room. Am I interrupting? 3 heads turned. Richard went pale. Daniel looked ashamed. Linda recovered instantly. Oh, Margaret, she said sweetly. We were just discussing baby logistics. I set the groceries down slowly. I heard my name. Linda tilted her head. Did you? Yes. Silence stretched. Richard spoke first. You misunderstood. No, I said. I finally understood. Daniel stood up. Margaret, I didn't mean. I raised a hand. Please, don't. I looked at Richard. 34 years of shared life, of compromises, of me bending so others wouldn't have to. I want the truth, I said, right now. Linda sighed dramatically. This is unnecessary. That's enough. I snapped, my voice sharper than I'd ever used with her. You don't speak for my marriage. She leaned back, offended. I'm just trying to help my family. And I'm realizing I replied that I was never considered part of it. Richard finally spoke. We thought it would be easier this way. Easier for whom? No one answered. That night I packed a bag. I didn't leave the house. Not yet. I moved into the guest room permanently, changed the lock on my personal filing cabinet, updated passwords, redirected my mail. I stopped cooking dinners, stopped attending family events, stopped explaining myself. Emily texted once, then twice, then stopped. Linda never reached out. Richard tried once awkwardly. You're overreacting. I smiled at him. You haven't seen my reaction yet. Behind the scenes, Susan moved quickly. Quiet asset separation, documentation, protection. And then one afternoon, she looked at me across her desk and said the words that made my pulse quicken. You have leverage they don't know about. I thought of Linda's confidence, of Emily's laughter, of Richard's silence. Good, I said, because I'm done being invisible. And for the first time since that Thanksgiving dinner, I wasn't reacting to their betrayal. I was preparing my response. Leverage changes the way you breathe. Once Susan said the word, I felt my spine straighten in a way it hadn't in years. I walked out of her office lighter, not because things were resolved, but because I finally knew the truth of my position. Richard and his family thought I was passive. They were wrong. What they didn't know was that 5 years earlier, when Richard insisted we refinance the house to simplify finances, I had insisted on one condition: my name on everything. Deed, insurance, decision authority. He had agreed without reading the fine print. Richard never read fine print. He trusted me to handle details. That trust would become his undoing. What they also didn't know was that I had quietly loaned Richard money over the years. Not gifts, loans, for Daniel's college gap year, for a failed investment Richard never mentioned again, for the emergency when Linda's company nearly collapsed during a bad quarter. Every transfer documented, every agreement signed, stored neatly in my filing cabinet. Susan had reviewed them with raised eyebrows. They assumed you were generous, she said, not meticulous. I smiled then, a small private smile. At home, the atmosphere turned cold. Richard moved around me like I was furniture that might suddenly speak. Daniel stopped visiting. Emily stopped pretending. Then came the invitation. A family meeting? Linda's house, Sunday afternoon. Richard told me about it over dinner I hadn't cooked. We should all talk. Clear the air. Am I invited? I asked calmly, or expected. He hesitated. Invited. I nodded. Then I'll come. Susan had advised against confrontation without preparation. I ignored her. Some moments require presence. Linda's house was immaculate as always. White furniture no one actually sat on. Photos arranged like trophies. Emily greeted me with a tight smile. Daniel avoided my eyes. Linda gestured for us to sit. We're all here because we care, she began. I said nothing. She continued, the baby is coming. Stress isn't good for anyone. We need unity. Unity. The word tasted bitter. Richard reached for my hand. I pulled away. I'll be direct, Linda said, losing patience. You're making this difficult. I met her gaze by existing. Emily scoffed. This isn't about you. I leaned forward. It's always been about me. You just didn't realize it. Silence. I turned to Richard. Tell them. He swallowed. Margaret thinks. I know, I corrected. I don't think. I know. I laid the documents on the table, copies only, enough to change the temperature in the room. Loans, liens, agreements. Linda's confident expression faltered. Emily frowned, confused. Daniel picked up a page and went pale. What is this? Emily asked. Reality, I said. The part you never bothered to learn. Richard looked at me like he was seeing a stranger. You wouldn't use this against family. Family doesn't erase you quietly, I replied. Linda stood. This is extortion. No, I said softly. This is consequence. I gathered my things and left without waiting for a response. That night, Richard didn't come home. The silence that followed was loud. 3 days passed. No calls, no apologies, just tension stretching like a wire ready to snap. On the 4th day, Richard returned. He looked older, smaller. We need to talk, he said. I gestured to the chair across from me. Sit. He sat. They're scared, he admitted. I nodded, as they should be. He ran a hand through his hair. Linda thinks you're trying to punish us. I laughed once, sharp. I'm protecting myself. The fact that it feels like punishment to you should tell you something. He looked down. I never meant for it to go this far. But you let it, I replied. Every time you stayed silent. He didn't argue. Susan called later that afternoon. They've contacted a lawyer, she said. Linda wants to contest the agreements. Can she? I asked. No, Susan replied. They're airtight, but this escalates things. Good, I said. I'm tired of the quiet. The escalation came faster than expected. Emily showed up at the house while Richard was out. Her eyes were red, her tone sharp. You're tearing this family apart, she accused. I folded my hands. No, I'm refusing to be dismantled. She laughed bitterly. You think money makes you powerful? I think clarity does. She leaned closer. If you cared about Daniel, you'd stop. I stood. If you cared about Daniel, you wouldn't have let your mother convince him I was disposable. Her face changed then. Fear flickered. Because she understood something finally. I wasn't bluffing. 2 days later, Susan called again. This time her voice was excited. They made a mistake, she said. What kind? Linda transferred funds she shouldn't have. From an account tied to your agreements. I closed my eyes, meaning she handed us proof. The proof was devastating. Emails, transfers, conversations assuming I'd never notice. We filed within hours. The fallout was immediate. Linda's accounts were frozen pending investigation. Emily panicked. Daniel stopped answering his phone. Richard sat at the kitchen table staring at nothing. I didn't know she'd do that, he said quietly. I poured myself coffee. You didn't want to know. He looked up. What happens now? I met his gaze. Now you learn what it's like to be excluded. Outside, the world went on. Cars passed. Neighbors waved. Inside, a reckoning had begun. And I was no longer afraid of it. The first official notice arrived on a Monday morning, delivered by courier, thick envelope, legal language heavy enough to bruise. Linda Whitaker was under investigation for financial misconduct. I read the letter twice, not because I didn't understand it, but because I needed to feel it settle into my bones. For decades, Linda had moved through rooms like gravity bent toward her. Money, authority, confidence built on the assumption that no one would ever question her. Now someone was. And it wasn't me, not directly. That was the most satisfying part. Richard stood in the doorway as I read his face drained of color. This is serious, he said. Yes, I replied. It is. She could lose everything. I looked up at him. So could I have. He opened his mouth, then closed it again. There was nothing left to argue. Every defense he might have offered had already collapsed under the weight of evidence and years of neglect. The phone rang constantly that week. Daniel called once, left a voicemail full of strained sincerity. Margaret, I didn't know. I swear. Mom said you were fine with everything, that you wanted distance. Distance, the lie of convenience. Emily sent a message longer than any she'd ever sent me before. Apologies tangled with excuses, pregnancy hormones, stress, misunderstandings. She ended it with, "We're family. Let's not destroy everything." I deleted it. Susan advised silence. "Let them feel uncertainty," she said. "It's the only language they understand right now." So I let the silence stretch. Linda did not stay silent. She called from a blocked number one evening, her voice tight, stripped of warmth. "You did this." "No," I said calmly. "I documented it." "You're vindictive," she hissed. "I'm accurate." She laughed bitterly. "You think this ends with me? Richard will resent you. Daniel will never forgive you." I leaned back in my chair. They already didn't. She hung up. 2 days later, the news broke locally. Not headlines, but whispers. A businesswoman under review. Irregular transfers. Family entanglements. Emily stopped posting baby updates. Daniel stopped answering messages entirely. Richard stopped pretending we were still a couple. He moved into the guest room without discussion. The house became divided by silence and footsteps carefully placed to avoid one another. And in that quiet, I felt something unfamiliar. Peace. Not happiness, not yet, but peace. On Friday, Susan called with an update. They're offering mediation. I smiled. Already? They're afraid. Good. At the mediation table, Linda looked smaller, still polished, still controlled. But the confidence was cracked. She didn't look at me at first. "This has gone too far," she said finally. "We can settle this quietly." "Quietly," I echoed. "Like you planned to erase me quietly." Richard shifted uncomfortably. Daniel stared at the table. Linda exhaled sharply. "What do you want?" There it was. The question she had never expected to ask me. "I want what I should have had all along," I said. "Acknowledgement, protection, and distance." Emily frowned. "Distance? I will not be part of this family arrangement anymore," I said. "Not emotionally, not financially." Richard looked up. "Margaret." "I'm not finished," I said. Susan slid documents forward. "My client will be separating assets immediately. A formal agreement ensuring no future obligations. And a public acknowledgement of her role and contributions issued in writing." Linda stiffened. "Public." "Yes," I said. "Truth has a way of needing air." No one argued. That was when I knew I had already won. The acknowledgement came out a week later. A carefully worded statement. Gratitude. Recognition. My name spelled correctly, finally attached to years of unpaid labor and invisible sacrifice. It circulated quietly, among friends, business contacts. People who had once nodded at me without curiosity now reached out with sudden warmth. Funny how respect arrives once it's documented. Richard read the statement at the kitchen table, eyes scanning the words that admitted what he had never said out loud. "You didn't have to do this," he murmured. "Yes," I replied, "I did." We finalized the separation the following month. No drama, no shouting, just signatures and the quiet acknowledgement that our marriage had ended long before the paperwork caught up. Daniel did not attend. Emily sent a brief message after the baby was born. A photo, a neutral caption. No apology, no invitation. I wished the child well, nothing more. Linda's empire didn't collapse entirely, but it fractured. Partnerships dissolved. Influence thinned. The woman who had once commanded rooms now found doors closing politely, permanently. Karma doesn't always roar. Sometimes it whispers. I moved out in the spring. A smaller house. Sunlight. Windows I opened without asking permission. I filled the space with plants and quiet mornings and coffee drunk slowly without commentary. One afternoon, as I was unpacking, Susan called. "They won't bother you again," she said. "They've learned." "I hope so," I replied, "but it's not my concern anymore." That night, I sat alone on my porch and watched the sky darken. I thought about all the years I had mistaken endurance for virtue, about how often women like me are taught that patience is love and silence is strength. They're not. Clarity is strength. Choosing yourself is not betrayal. It is survival. I didn't destroy a family. I stepped out of one that had already decided I was expendable. And in doing so, I finally gave myself the loyalty I had been waiting for from everyone else. The reckoning had passed. What remained was something quieter, a life that belonged to me. Freedom has an aftertaste no one warns you about. Once the dust settled, once the apologies dried up and the legal documents were filed away, I expected relief to feel like a celebration. Instead, it arrived as something quieter and far more unsettling. Space. No one needed me. No one called asking where a document was, what a payment meant, how to smooth over an awkward conversation. My phone stayed silent for hours at a time. At first, I mistook that silence for loneliness. Then I realized it was absence of exploitation. I turned 60 the summer after the separation. Richard did not call. Daniel sent a short message. Emily sent nothing. Linda predictably disappeared entirely. What surprised me were the others. Former co-workers, old neighbors, women I hadn't spoken to in years reached out after hearing fragments of what had happened. They didn't ask for details. They didn't offer advice. They simply said, "I've been there." One afternoon, I met Claire for coffee. We had worked together 20 years earlier. She leaned across the table and said quietly, "You did what most of us only fantasize about." I laughed, but my throat tightened. It didn't feel brave. "Of course not," she replied. "Bravery never does when you're inside it." That conversation stayed with me. I began volunteering at a local community center, mostly to fill time. One morning, a woman in her late 40s sat across from me, eyes swollen, voice trembling, as she described being pushed out of her own family business by her brothers. "They say I'm too emotional," she said. I recognized the language instantly. That night, alone in my new living room, I opened a box I hadn't touched since moving. Inside were old photos, holidays, birthdays, Daniel as a boy smiling beside me, unaware of how fragile gratitude can be. I didn't cry. Instead, I felt something like release, because grief, I learned, doesn't always come from loss. Sometimes it comes from clarity. A few weeks later, I received a letter from Daniel. Handwritten, awkward, careful. He wrote about the baby, about therapy, about guilt. He did not ask for forgiveness. He asked for understanding. I folded the letter and placed it back in the envelope. I didn't respond. Not out of cruelty, but honesty. I was no longer the person responsible for making things easier for him. The hardest lesson of that year was learning that healing does not require reconciliation. Sometimes it requires distance, and sometimes distance is the greatest kindness you can offer yourself. The call came on a cold November evening. "Richard." I almost didn't answer. When I did, his voice sounded unfamiliar, smaller, tired. "I just wanted you to know," he said, "Linda sold the house." I waited. "She's downsizing," he added. "Things aren't what they were." "I see," I replied. There was a pause. Daniel moved back in with her. Another pause. Emily left. That one landed differently. Not with satisfaction, not with pity, just inevitability. Richard sighed. "I should have listened to you." "Yes," I said simply. He waited for more. For absolution. For reassurance that regret counted as redemption. It didn't. "I hope you're well," he said finally. "I am," I replied, and for the first time it wasn't a performance. After the call, I sat by the window and watched leaves scatter across the street. Change always looks like destruction from the outside. Only later does it reveal itself as clearing. That winter, I hosted my first Thanksgiving alone. I cooked only what I liked. I ate slowly. I didn't set extra places out of habit. I toasted myself, to the woman who endured, to the woman who woke up, to the woman who stopped asking to be chosen. As the year closed, I understood something that had taken me decades to learn. Revenge isn't always about watching someone fall. Sometimes it's about refusing to fall with them. I wasn't vindicated by their losses. I was vindicated by my survival, and by the quiet certainty that no one would ever make decisions about my worth without my consent again. The story wasn't over yet, but the pain no longer owned the narrative. I did. The reckoning I didn't expect came from a place I hadn't been looking. It was early spring when Susan called and asked if I had a moment. Her tone wasn't urgent, but it carried weight. "Daniel has filed a petition," she said. "Not against you, against the trust." I closed my eyes. What kind of petition? "He's asking the court to formally recognize your contributions to the family estate. Retroactively." That made me sit down. "For what purpose?" I asked. Susan paused. "He says it's for the record, that he wants the truth documented, even if it changes nothing." For years, I had imagined apologies coming wrapped in desperation or demands. This wasn't that. This was inconvenient honesty, costly honesty. "I didn't prompt this," Susan added. "In fact, his lawyer advised against it." Of course they did. Truth complicates things. The hearing was small, quiet. No press. Just a judge, two attorneys, and Daniel standing alone at a podium that looked far too big for him. He didn't look at me when he spoke. He stared straight ahead, voice tight. "I benefited from a narrative that erased her," he said, "and I let it happen because it was comfortable." The judge listened, took notes, asked questions. Daniel answered them all. When it was over, the judge issued a simple statement. The court record would reflect my financial and emotional contributions to the family over 3 decades. No assets changed hands, no money moved. But my existence was no longer deniable. Outside the courtroom, Daniel approached me cautiously. "I didn't do this to fix us," he said. "I did it because I couldn't live with the lie anymore." I studied his face. The boy I raised was still there, buried under years of entitlement and influence. "I believe you," I said. He exhaled. "That's more than I expected." "Don't misunderstand," I continued. "Belief isn't reconciliation." He nodded. "I know." We stood there awkwardly, two people connected by history but no longer bound by obligation. "I hope you're happy," he said finally. "I am," I replied, "and I hope you learn to be." He smiled faintly and walked away. That was the last time I saw him. That night, alone in my house, I poured myself a glass of wine and sat on the floor among unpacked boxes I'd never bothered to finish. For the first time, I cried. Not from pain, from release. Because even without forgiveness, even without reunion, the truth had been spoken out loud. And that mattered. The final chapter of this story didn't arrive with drama. It arrived quietly on an ordinary morning when I caught my reflection in the mirror and realized I no longer looked tired. Not just rested, unburdened. I was 62 by then. My hair had more silver than brown. My life was smaller in the ways that mattered and larger in the ways that didn't. I worked part-time by choice. Volunteered when I felt like it. Spent holidays traveling or staying home in silence that felt full rather than empty. Richard sent a card once a year. Polite, regretful. I stopped opening them. Linda faded into irrelevance. Her name came up occasionally, always attached to the phrase used to be powerful. Emily remarried, quickly, predictably. Daniel moved away. And I stayed. One afternoon at the community center, a woman in her late 50s sat across from me, hands shaking. She had just been written out of a family business she'd helped build. "They say I'm being emotional," she whispered. I leaned forward. "They always do." She looked at me, eyes searching. "What did you do when it happened to you?" I thought about Thanksgiving dinners, about baby showers, about documents slid across tables and silence masquerading as peace. I stopped explaining, I said, and I started documenting. She laughed weakly. "I don't want revenge." "Neither did I replied. "I wanted dignity." That's the part no one tells you. Revenge stories aren't really about punishment. They're about reclaiming authorship. For decades, my story had been told by others. Framed, edited, minimized. I was the background character in my own life, applauded for endurance, dismissed for inconvenience. I changed that, not with shouting, not with cruelty, but with clarity. If you're listening to this and something in your chest feels tight, let me say this plainly. If your family benefits from your silence, it is not love. If your worth disappears the moment you stop giving, it was never recognized to begin with. And if standing up for yourself makes others uncomfortable, that discomfort is not your responsibility. It is the cost of truth. I didn't destroy a family. I exposed a lie. And in doing so, I gave myself something no inheritance ever could. Peace. If this story resonated with you, if you've lived through something similar, or wish you'd had the courage sooner, let me know. Leave a comment. Share your story. And if you want to hear more stories like this, stories about women who choose themselves without apology, subscribe and stay with us. Some chapters end quietly, but the best ones begin when you finally take the pen back into your own hands.